With these welcoming words, now I give floor to someone who is Professor of Diplomacy at the Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy in Australia. He is author of several books on Afghanistan, and one of his latest books is Transition in Afghanistan, Hope, Despair, and Dilemmas to State Building. It's a pleasure to have him here today with us, so please welcome Professor William Maley.
Thank you very much for your kind words of introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. This is actually my first ever visit to Sweden, so it's been an opportunity for me not only to reflect on the situation in Afghanistan, but meet some very remarkable people as well, and I'd like to pay tribute in particular to Karen and Ingrid for the initiative of holding this particular gathering. Before I move into my substantive remarks, I thought I'd just share a couple of resources with you, a couple of things that I've written and then one written by our next speaker. I did a book in 2016 called What is a Refugee, which is available in English and Danish, but not Swedish, unfortunately, but it may be interesting as a source of some historical background to the refugee experience more broadly. Waris mentioned this book called Transition in Afghanistan, Hope, Despair and the Limits of State Building, which in a way elaborates in much more detail some of the points that I'll be making briefly in my presentation this morning. And then I also wanted to share with you what is, I think, now a definitive study, Dr. Niamatullah Ibrahimi's book, The Hazaras and the Afghan State, Rebellion, Exclusion and the Struggle for Recognition. Dr. Ibrahimi will be with us online very shortly, but for those who are actually working with members of the Hazara community on issues of vulnerability, this, I think, is an extraordinarily important and valuable resource with a great deal of historical material about the experiences of Hazaras that can very usefully be factored into calculations of the kinds of dangers that they currently face. And in a sense, the dangers faced by Hazaras become part of the wider context of refugee movements from Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. Because if one seeks to identify a particular point that proved to be a trigger for substantial movements, it was the massacre of perhaps 2,000, perhaps 4,000, perhaps 6,000 Hazaras in Mazar-i-Sharif in August 1998 by the Taliban. No one knows exactly what the final death toll was from the massacre, but a study by Rupert Colville from UNHCR came to the conclusion that it was a very, very gruesome episode indeed, and the word of what had happened spread to many different parts of Afghanistan, and we certainly noticed in Australia a huge surge at that point in people of Hazara background finally opting to leave the country and seek protection somewhere else. It was a crucial trigger, and then of course once people begin to move, exit comes to be known to other people as a potentially rational response to an acutely dangerous situation. But to understand the wider context, which is the focus of my remarks this morning, I want to do 4 things. I want to talk about the context and challenges of politics in Afghanistan. I want to talk about governance problems. I want to talk about the problem of insurgent violence, and I'll conclude with a couple of comments on where things might move from here. And it's worth noting that historically, violence is a central component of state formation and has been in most parts of the world. That whilst there are metaphors about the formation of the state in terms of social contract, one finds this in the writings of Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau, the sociological reality is that states have tended to be a product of violence, and the use of violence to establish the power of one particular group that can then claim legitimacy for what it does, and Charles Tilley has documented this in great detail. And this is certainly one of the factors at the heart of the crystallisation of the Afghan state initially from the 18th century. But the Afghan state played a number of different roles as well. It was a buffer state in the 19th century, and as Amir Abdurrahman Khan from 1880 to 1901 consolidated his position. Hazaras were amongst the most suffering and victims in the so-called Hazara Wars around 1893. In the 20th century, Afghanistan came to be seen as a remote state, a long way away from anywhere else. This led to a rather unfortunate orientalisation of discussion of Afghanistan, that instead of Afghanistan being seen as a real place with real people, far too many people with Lawrence of Arabia complexes came to see Afghanistan as a very different part of the world where people are different from us. And this had the unfortunate effect of blanching the sense of common humanity that actually unites Afghans with people in many different parts of the world. Afghanistan then became a venue of Cold War rivalry after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and this saw Sunni Muslim groups based in Pakistan being armed by the Pakistani Services Intelligence Directorate with funding from the United States in order to create mayhem for the Soviets and deny them the easy control of the country to which they'd undoubtedly aspired when they sent forces into Afghanistan in December 1979. This is also a reminder that although the most recent phase in Afghanistan's history of conflict dates back to 2001, Afghanistan has now experienced over 40 years of dislocation from the time of the communist coup in April 1978. It's never really had a normal period as a quiet state in the period since then. And imagine what it would be like if a country like Sweden or a country like Australia had had that period of disruption. It makes it very difficult for ordinary people, and it makes exit seem more and more a rational kind of approach to trying to build a life for the future. Afghanistan then became a theatre of regional rivalry after 1992, and particularly with the rise of the Taliban with Pakistani support from 1994, with Pakistan's objective being to deny India an opportunity to build influence within Afghanistan in a way that could be geopolitically unsatisfactory from Islamabad's point of view. And then after 2001, we've witnessed an internationally supported transition, but one which lost a lot of oxygen early in the peace when the United States' attention drifted to Iraq in 2003. And in this kind of transition, momentum matters. And the loss of momentum actually took place early in Afghanistan's transition and was very palpable and obvious to people on the ground in Afghanistan itself. And this is important because successful transitions are, above all else, a psychological exercise designed to persuade people that things are going to get better. Because in a country like Afghanistan that's had decades of dislocation, it doesn't pay to be on the losing side. So if people think that those mounting a transition are going to be losers in the long run, they will lose support, not because people necessarily dislike them, but because they don't want to be associated with losers. And in that sense, right up to now, the great danger for the Afghan government is not that the Taliban or ISIS will grind their way militarily to the heart of Kabul in the way that the Soviet army did in Berlin in 1945. It's rather that there will be a cascade, that if 2 or 3 major towns or cities fell to the Taliban at one particular moment, lots of people could switch sides, as happened in 1992 when the communist regime collapsed, and in 2001 when the Taliban regime collapsed. And the effects can be quite dramatic. The initiation of transition after 2001 led some people to think of Afghanistan as moving into a golden age. But here it's very important to distinguish between the experiences of people at the top of the political elite, where there are many more people of a Hazara background than at any time since the communist regime was in place, and the vast bulk of the population who are not members of the political elite and who do not enjoy the protections that ministers and deputy ministers enjoy in their day-to-day lives. And so it's very easy to have a situation in which one can mistake the presence within the elite of people from different groups for a situation in which groups are no longer subject to persecution or discrimination at the hands of non-state actors at the street level. And that, of course, is the reality which is directly relevant to the overwhelming majority of asylum seekers that one encounters in Western countries. They are not parts of the political elite and they do not enjoy the protections that accompany elite membership. Let me say something about governance. There was a lot of hope in 2001 with the Bonn Agreement and in 2004 with the new Afghan constitution that Afghanistan's political problems would be effectively solved. But in fact, a lot of problems were not solved and new problems have emerged since then that have gravely contaminated the operation of the political system. Firstly, the presidential system, strong presidential system on paper, does not work particularly well. Political scientists don't recommend presidential systems for countries with over 50 ethnic groups to start with. That's a recipe for large numbers of people feeling excluded from the corridors of power. And it's also the case that the skills to be president of a country like Afghanistan are pretty demanding and few candidates are likely to have all the relevant skills. Ahmed Karzai, president from 2001 to 2014, had some of the skills one required, but not all. He'd grown up politically in Peshawar with the Afghan resistance in the 1980s in a state-free environment. And so his conception of politics was not policy development and implementation, but networking and alliance building and patron-client relationships, which led to the emergence on his watch in Afghanistan of what I've called a neo-patrimonial system, which is where bureaucracy and patronage are entangled and entwined with each other, and who you are associated with may be a much greater, more powerful determination of what you can achieve than what ideas you have. And that's unfortunate from a policy point of view. There was also a great deal of fragmentation among central bureaucracies because 29 departments of government were established following the Bonn Agreement. They probably needed 6 to 8. And these ended up in conflict with each other, very often to obtain resources that donors were bringing into the country. If you have bureaucratic complexity like that, and you have a lot of aid money coming in, you have a very sinister problem, which is corruption. The way in which donors seek to lubricate what is a dysfunctional system is by paying people off at different points in the system in order to get signatures for approval of projects and rapid implementation of what their own principles are demanding that they achieve. And Afghanistan fell victim to this very quickly, and international aid, whilst it did some good, also provided stakes over which people could struggle and fuel to run a neo-patrimonial system. This was one of the factors that led to a plummeting in confidence about the direction in which Afghanistan was travelling. In 2004, a survey suggested that 64% of respondents thought that Afghanistan was going in the right direction. When the Asia Foundation ran the same survey in 2009, the conclusion was that 38% thought the country was going in the right direction, a huge drop. And this was not a promising development for President Karzai going up for re-election in 2009 because he'd avoided a runoff election in 2004 only by 5.5 percentage points. This set the scene for his supporters to orchestrate epic levels of fraud to return him to the presidency in 2009, and the fact that the international community in effect was quite sanguine about that then normalised the idea of fraud, which again contaminated the 2014 presidential election. And when you have several major elections with real ramifications for power that are contaminated by fraud, you begin to erode the foundations of political legitimacy in a country, and a lot of Afghans are now very despairing about the trajectory of politics in their homeland. A national unity government was set up as a kind of internationally brokered bargain after 2014. These kind of arrangements very rarely work because you're putting people who don't trust each other together, and that tends to be a barrier to the rapid implementation of the kind of policies that a country may need. And that's certainly what Afghanistan has experienced in the 4 years or so since the national unity government was set up. This has led to a continuing sense of unease at the public level about the direction in which Afghanistan is travelling. And to the extent that there are positive things going on in Afghanistan, it's not so much because of constitutional change or the international military presence, but rather the way in which those have facilitated something else, globalisation. The one encouraging thing about Afghanistan is that there are incredibly bright, competent young people of world class emerging now as a new generation in Afghanistan. But these are also people who, through access to television, realise that there is a world outside Afghanistan which is preaching the importance of human rights, liberty and personal autonomy. And it's hardly surprising when countries like Australia or Sweden or the United States or other European states trumpet this as their defining features, that people who feel that they have a real risk of being persecuted in Afghanistan look to those particular states as destinations to which they would head as moral beacons in the world. And it's sometimes tempting for political leaders to try to tarnish their own reputations as moral beacons as a way of stopping this kind of thing happening, but it will probably take more than they can do in the short run in order to dispel the positive image that liberal democracy has come to enjoy within Afghanistan. Now, the great problem that hangs over all of this is insurgent violence. This has an enormous amount to do with cross-border sanctuaries in Pakistan, which have allowed the Taliban to resume their military activities within Afghanistan since about 2003, and the consequences for ordinary people in many different parts of Afghanistan have been dire. The UN statistics on civilian casualties in Afghanistan suggest that about 20,000 people in the last 10 years have perished at the hands of anti-government insurgent elements. But of course, in addition to those, you have people who've been wounded but haven't died, and you have a much larger network of people who might have been dependent upon the deceased or the injured for their day-to-day livelihoods, whose lives have been devastated by this kind of violence. And of course, if one had 20,000 civilians being killed in a 10-year period in a country like Sweden or a country like Australia, we would conclude that the end of the world was nigh. There's no reason to think that Afghans have reached a point where they consider this kind of thing just a normal part of everyday life. If you talk to people in Kabul, they live with a pervasive fear that a family member who goes out in the morning may not come home safely in the evening. That's something which we've virtually never had to contemplate in countries like Sweden or Australia, but it becomes a searing part of the human experience in Afghanistan. On top of that, there have been some major crises. The Kunduz Crisis in 2015, when the city of Kunduz fell to the Taliban. More recently, the Ghazni Crisis just a couple of months ago, where the city of Ghazni fell to the Taliban, who, during their occupations of these cities, behaved with every bit as dramatic a manifestation of brutality as one associated with their reputation from the 1990s. And this is worth bearing in mind when people suggest that the Taliban may somehow have reformed and are a less threatening force than they had proved to be for ordinary people in the 1990s. Apart from dramatic events like this, there's been a great deal of ambient insecurity in Afghanistan, which often passes below the radar of embassies and agencies in Kabul, but which is menacingly real in the daily lives of ordinary people. And Hazaras are kidnapped on roads, they're murdered. A famous case in 2015 was that of the Zabul 7 travellers, including a 9-year-old girl who was garroted by the Taliban when they fell into their hands. And more recently, the extraordinarily violent attacks by the terrorist group ISIS on targets in Kabul. Over 700 people have been killed in the last 2 years in bombings just in the one suburb of Dashti Bachet in Kabul. Some of these have been very dramatic. We've seen the attack earlier this year on the higher education training preparation facility, and then on a sports hall. And one of the abiding concerns of people in this particular area is that the state has proved incapable of providing them with adequate protection on a day-to-day basis. And that's something that's worth bearing in mind. No matter what the aspirations of the Afghan state may be, it is currently and for the foreseeable future will be incapable of providing people with the kind of protection that they need in order to be able to live safe and meaningful lives. Now, this is not something new. It became, the dangers for Hazaras became very apparent on the 6th of December 2011 when there was a bombing attack that killed a large number of Hazaras gathered for a religious ceremony, and in fact a photograph that was taken immediately after the attack won the Pulitzer Prize for photography that year for an Afghan photographer, Masoud Hosseini, who was on the spot. And then mayhem has continued in Kabul and in other parts of the country, reminding us actually that there is no realistic sense in which one can say that there are safe areas within Afghanistan. When institutions are as fragile as they are in Afghanistan, an area which seems safe today can be a site of violence and conflict tomorrow. I was in Mazar-e-Sharif in May 1997 when the UN was actually flying refugees from Pakistan back to Afghanistan as part of a managed repatriation program on the basis that Mazar-e-Sharif was a safe area. Malik Pahlawan staged a coup against Abdul Rashid Dostum. I went to a meeting at the UN guest house in Mazar where the heads of UN agencies were, oh, we don't think anything very much is going on here. I said, well, I think the balloon's going up and I'm flying out tomorrow. So I flew out the next day. The day after that, the UN guest house was shot up with heavy machine guns. And the entire situation unravelled spectacularly. And it's ever since then I've relied on my own instinct rather than on private security companies for advice about how to position myself in Afghanistan, and embassies have gone even further. They have locked themselves behind multiple layers of concrete and sandbags to the point that what passes for country information on Afghanistan is often the product of an echo chamber in which people who are not doing empirical research of their own are replicating rumours that are being shared amongst a highly insulated community, and one needs to be wary of that when one's looking at what purports to be information about Afghanistan on refugee circumstances. Just let me conclude very briefly with some comments on where things might go from here. Refugee movements continue, and it's ultimately because in certain circumstances the most rational response to a perilous situation is exit. It's the situation that anyone would choose if they found themselves in the same kind of situation that refugees confront. At the moment there are attempts to locate people in countries like Turkey and build a wall around Europe. This seems to me to be a higher form of madness, actually. If one looks at how the Taliban emerged, it was because refugees were warehoused for a long period in Pakistan without there being much hope, and they became easy pickings for radical groups. And if one really wants a volcano sitting on the doorstep of Europe, one way to do it is to warehouse refugees in Turkey, give them no hope of a more meaningful life than existing on the fringes of society can provide, and wait for the radicals to come in to recruit them. And that's not something that Europe is going to welcome in the long run. There's an ongoing talk about political settlement in Afghanistan. My view is that this is wishful thinking of the dreamiest possible variety. I've got a chapter in my book which sets out in detail why I'm very sceptical about the prospect that there's suddenly going to be an agreement between the Taliban and the Afghan government that's going to make everything hunky-dory and desirable for people to return. We saw President Ghani reach out to the Taliban and indeed announce a ceasefire during the first Eid in June 2018, but it was striking that the Taliban didn't bite when this was offered to them again during the second Eid festival, and clearly they had become very alarmed about fraternisation between their shock troops and members of the Afghan community and wanted to stop anything like that happening in the future, a classic manifestation of the fear of cascades, actually. And then one faces the ongoing problem of the Pakistan state. There is no particular reason at the moment to think that Pakistan is either under sufficient pressure from the United States or under sufficient diplomatic suasion from the Chinese that it is at all likely to shift from its long-term policy of supporting militants in Afghanistan. Essentially, the calculation in Islamabad is that its most desired outcome is what it had in the late 1990s, almost a client regime with the Taliban. If it can't get that, its next most desired outcome is a disorderly Afghanistan. Its least desired outcome is an orderly and peaceful Afghanistan that is sympathetic to India. And that needs to be borne in mind when one looks at the geopolitics of the region. So unless and until Western powers do something about the Pakistan problem, the situation in Afghanistan is not going to be resolved. And that then has direct ramifications for refugee movements, because there is no realistic reason to think the Taliban, let alone ISIS, are any more attuned to human rights issues now than they have been in the future, and gross human rights violations are likely to persist in the bulk of the country for the foreseeable future, and that becomes a crucial driving force for refugee outflows. So I hope this gives you some sense of the complexities of the situation, but also some sense of the fundamental moral importance of the enterprise of refugee protection, refugee assistance, which Karen and Ingrid have contributed so helpfully to supporting by bringing us together today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor William Maley, for explaining the military and political challenges that the country is facing. You're author of several books on Afghanistan, and you explained thoroughly the problems in the governance of Afghanistan and also the problems of the insurgent violence. And you mentioned the role of cross-border sanctuaries. Without any doubt, Pakistan has provided sanctuaries for Taliban. The leadership of Taliban, Mullah Muhammad Umar, Mullah Mansour was shot in the border near Quetta, and Umar was dead in Karachi for a long time, but it wasn't disclosed by the Pakistani government. And this has been admitted openly by the political leaders of Pakistan, the former president and Army Chief of Staff, Pervez Musharraf, and also the ISI Director General Asad Durrani. They have admitted their interference in Afghanistan. I would like to ask you, what does Pakistan gain from instability in Afghanistan?
Mainly a minimization of any prospect of Indian influence within Afghanistan. There is a strong argument that can be mounted to the effect that Pakistan has created a huge danger for itself by supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan, because it was highly predictable that this would reflux into Pakistan, as indeed it did with the establishment of the Tehrik-i-Taliban, the Pakistan Taliban movement that carried out atrocities such as the killing of 194 school students in Peshawar at a high school in December 2014. So at one level it's been a very dangerous policy for Pakistan itself, but again the distinction between people at the elite level and people at the mass level is as important in Pakistan as it is in Afghanistan, and the military is often pretty well insulated in Pakistan from the consequences of these kinds of actions. Now, there is a long history here. In 1893, a boundary was drawn by Sir Mortimer Durrand between British India and Afghanistan, known as the Durrand Line, which had the effect of dividing members of the Pashtun ethnic group between Afghanistan and British India. In 1947, when the partition of India came into prospect, the then government of Afghanistan revived a demand for self-determination for Pashtuns who were in British India. Nothing particularly came of this, but as a result, Afghanistan was the one country that voted against the admission of Pakistan to membership of the United Nations, and for the next 30 years or so, paradoxically, relations were much more cordial between Afghanistan and Hindu-majority India than between Afghanistan and Muslim-majority Pakistan. Now, what this meant was that when the communist coup took place in Afghanistan and the Soviet invasion, Pakistan, receiving large numbers of refugees and seeking to reposition itself as a good guy in a Cold War context after the execution of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, looked to support from within the Afghan refugee community and the Afghan resistance, not nationalist groups of the kind that might in the future resume this dispute over the border, but religiously radical groups. most famously the Hezb Islami of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. This then created all sorts of ongoing problems for Afghanistan, since some of these groups were not particularly gifted at fighting the Soviets, but were pretty good at assassinating commanders of other resistance groups and parties. And that, as it were, injected into the bloodstream of the Pakistani intelligence the appetite for trying to manipulate the politics in Afghanistan. And there was a golden opportunity for Pakistan right back in 1992 just to take a hands-off approach and try to exploit some goodwill that was still there because of the hospitality that had been provided to Afghan refugees over a long period of time. But Pakistan failed completely in that respect. Instead, it tried to push the Hezb Islami as the dominant force within Afghanistan. That failed. It was ultimately why another element of the Pakistan state supported the emergence of the Taliban. And so anti-Pakistani sentiment surged once again in Afghanistan, and not surprisingly, Afghans tend to see what goes on across the border in Pakistan as a fundamental source of the difficulties which they face. There's very strong empirical grounding for that suspicion.
Right. They want instability in Afghanistan due to two main reasons, what I get from your answer. One is that they are afraid of the growing Indian influence in Afghanistan. And second is the issue of Duro Line, which has still been not officially recognized by the Afghan government.
Yes.
But they also have their reasons. They say that India in Afghanistan, they have almost 3 consulates, including the embassy. They don't need 3 consulates. They are there because they want to destabilize, to bring instability to Pakistan. Yeah. And if you see the current ruling party of India, the BJP party, the Janata Party, their vision is also to separate Balochistan from Pakistan and to separate Pakhtunkhwa from Pakistan, and also then the Sindh province that they want to join back with India. So the only province that remains is Punjab. And the other reason, which is the Duro Line, they claim that throughout history, the king and then the rulers of Afghanistan, they have recognized the Duran Treaty, but still it's by the current government and the Karzai government, they denied those. So they have their reasons. What would you say to that?
My view is, and it's a very personal view, is that the Durand Line issue is one that does Afghanistan no good whatsoever. There is the situation of the location of the boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan is a very different issue from, say, the independence of the Baltic states from the Soviet Union, or the independence of East Timor from Indonesia following the 1975 invasion. There's no appetite internationally to support Afghanistan's position on the Durand Line, and it actually becomes an obstacle to dealing with the Pakistan problem. On the other hand, the issue of Indian consulates in Afghanistan is, I think, pure propaganda. In fact, General Asad Durrani, the former ISI chief, in his memoirs that have just been published, makes the point that Pakistani claims about Indian consulates in Afghanistan are grossly exaggerated. And coming from a former ISI Director General, that's, I think, a fairly powerful statement to that effect. India actually has legitimate consular concerns in Afghanistan. Putting on my hat as a professor of diplomacy, there are a lot of Indian nationals in Afghanistan working on aid projects who are entitled to access consular support and probably need it in the places where Indian consulates are located. So a lot of what Pakistan says about India's presence in Afghanistan is actually very hot air rather than a substantive concern. But I'd also make the point that Pakistan is a country which talks a lot about sovereignty. It is entirely Afghanistan's sovereign entitlement to determine how many consulates it allows another state to have on Afghan territory. It is none of Pakistan's business if there are 1,000 Indian consulates in Afghanistan. Pakistan would actually do well to talk less about the rights of sovereignty and talk a little bit more about the duties of sovereignty, because one of the duties of a sovereign state is to prevent one's territory from being used for violent attacks on a neighbouring country. And that's an area where Pakistan is very vulnerable, to put it gently.
Okay, now we give the chance to you, the audience, to ask questions from Professor William Maley We have microphones, so please, whenever you have a question, have the microphone. Yes, there, please, in the fourth row, the gentleman. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. You talked about the bright young people in Afghanistan and the globalization's positive forces. I wonder if you think that these young people have the possibility, the force to bring stability and democracy to Afghanistan, and what kind of support could Sweden and the international community give these young people?
One needs to bear in mind, of course, that young people are not only a dynamic force, but also a fluid force in a country like Afghanistan. They can be a force for good, and a very powerful force for good. And it would certainly be a good idea for countries like Sweden to identify some of the best and the brightest in a country like Afghanistan and do what is possible to try to assist them through things like scholarships, through things like support for democratizing activities. At the same time, young people can also lapse into a sense of despair and disappointment, and if they don't leave their country, they can end up in the hands of quite radical groups. One of the factors that contributed to the communist coup in Afghanistan in April 1978 was that quite a large number of young people had gone through the university system in Afghanistan, but a fiscal crisis in the state meant that on graduation they were no longer able to access the near guaranteed employment that they had hoped to be able to obtain with the state, and that saw them drifting into more radical directions, into communist groups like Halk and Parcham, and into Islamist groups like the Afghan Muslim Youth Movement. Now, at the moment, there are some quite radical groups that are actively canvassing on campuses in universities in Afghanistan, like Jamiat Islam, which are seeking to recruit people. Hizb ut-Tahrir is doing this kind of thing as well. And if we're not careful, the danger is that these groups will prove the more successful in mobilizing young people, so that instead of being the positive force that they have the potential to be, they will end up being a negative force and part of a problem for the more secularized people, or the people who have a more modernist view of what the world has to offer. So in that sense, I think it is very important to think of creative ways in which one might support the more liberally minded people within Afghanistan. But it's actually difficult in the sense that many countries now put out travel warnings from their foreign ministries saying, do not travel to Afghanistan. This seems to drop off the radar when immigration bureaucracies are saying it's safe for you to go back to Afghanistan. But I've long been struck by the discrepancy between what foreign ministries say about travel to Afghanistan and what home ministries say about travel to Afghanistan. And that then has implications for insurance protection for people who might want to go and manage projects in Afghanistan. Well, I'm going to Afghanistan the week after next, and I have a hugely expensive travel policy that I bought from International SOS because my university's own blanket insurance policy will not cover Afghanistan. So there are lots of practical things like that that do come into play, and there's a lot to be said, I think, also looking at new technologies, distance education, mechanisms linking people in countries like Sweden and Australia to the best and the brightest in a country like Afghanistan. There is an opportunity for information sharing, the development of kind of electronic relationships. This is something that's going on through Facebook at the moment, but Facebook's also an ambiguous kind of asset because radical groups are making expensive use of Facebook and social media as well. So, the broad point you make, I certainly endorse.
The gentleman, the last row, there. Okay. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Professor, thank you very much for your summary. It enlightened me more and more. But I have another question. It's the future, the environmental future of Afghanistan. I read some articles saying that Afghanistan is facing a severe drought, and is lacking water resources in the future and cannot probably supply water to all its population. So have you any views on environmental situation in future in Afghanistan, and not only in Afghanistan, also in Pakistan or India, in
Yes.
those areas? Thank you.
Yes, no, this is an important point. Afghanistan is experiencing a severe drought in parts of the country at the moment. It's had that experience in the past. There was a very severe drought in 1972 that led to a famine. There's a 1974 book in French by Michael Barry called Afghanistan, which has a lot of very distressing testimony about the experience with drought and famine that rural Afghanistan encountered at that time. And one of the factors underpinning the coup against the monarchy in July 1973 was the sense that the government immediately before that had not addressed the problem of the drought sufficiently. Water is also a severe problem. One of the most severe manifestations of this is actually the drop in the water table in Kabul, because a great deal of the water supply for the city of Kabul, which has grown enormously in population in the last 15 or so years, is groundwater. So any fall in the water table has the potential ramification of an acute water shortage within a very large city. And of course, radical changes are made in cities. If you have mounting anger in a major city because people simply cannot get drinking water that they need on a day-to-day basis, then this is the kind of environment in which political consequences are likely to flow. I suspect that the drought is a manifestation of a wider problem of climate change that's being experienced worldwide, because we know from many different countries that damaging weather events of a sort that had not been experienced in recent history are now accumulating. And so I don't think there's an easy solution to the problem of drought or water supply in Afghanistan, but there's a study that's been done on this by the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit in Kabul, which will probably bring together the best practice recommendations that one can seek to find in this particular area. But it's certainly something which compounds the threat of persecution that may be the primary driver for people to leave Afghanistan. The more the ambient environment becomes profoundly unwelcoming and inhospitable, the more it is that the political dangers or the dangers of persecution for other convention reasons become the tipping point that lead people who've long tried to stay in Afghanistan finally to take the decision to leave.
Thank you. We have time just for one more question. Yeah, the gentleman in the last row.
Thanks, Professor Maley, for your presentation. I'm a master's student at Stockholm University Political Science Department. My question is, what are the other countries in the Middle East, say for example Turkey and Saudi Arabia, is playing, if they have any different agenda that are different with, different from other players in that region?
Look, it's a complex story. That country, to start with, the most obvious neighbour that people would want to note in these circumstances, Iran has long-standing interests in Afghanistan and a lot of Afghan refugees historically on its territory. Because Shiite Muslims are only a minority within the Afghan population, the Iranians, I think, realise that they have no likelihood of being able to dominate Afghanistan in any strong sense of the term, but they do have a watching brief in respect of the position of people of Shiite confession, particularly Hazaras within Afghanistan. At the same time, they're also happy to exploit people like that. And there's been a study recently carried out by Ahmad Shuja that looks at the way in which Afghan refugees in Iran, in effect, were being conscripted by the Iranians for dispatch to Syria, a very dangerous kind of theatre of operations. Now, this has led some people spuriously to suggest that the reason for ISIS attacks on Hazaras in Afghanistan is that people are going to Syria to fight, and that takes ISIS propaganda far too much at face value and underestimates the long-term antagonisms that are present from Sunni extremists against Shia. But Iran does have that two-sided kind of approach. two-faced may put it too strongly, because there are different elements of the Iranian state that are at play in shaping these different policy approaches. Saudi Arabia is certainly preoccupied at the moment with its own rivalry with Iran, and that can dispose it to support radical groups like the Taliban. And as yet unpublished study of the Taliban at war between 2002 and 2015, carried out by a very well-known London-based researcher, has concluded that the Taliban have been beneficiaries of far more international support in the last 13 years than almost any studies up to this point have credited. And of course the crucial support is sanctuaries provided by Pakistan, but they've also been receiving a great deal of financial support from sources in Saudi Arabia as well. And that may well continue as a sort of part of an anti-Iranian disposition to try to deny Iran influence within Afghanistan as well. So Afghanistan's position reminds me of a comment that was once made by a reader in psychology at Melbourne University in Australia, who was well known for engaging in academic controversies. His name was Frank Knopfelmacher. Someone said to him, "Frank, you have too many enemies." He said, "I have no enemies, I have friends who do not like me very much." And that has historically been Afghanistan's problem too, I think.
Thank you very much, Professor William Maley. I know you still have a lot of questions
I'll be around
to ask, but later Professor William Maley will participate in a panel discussion, so you can put forward your questions then. Thank you once
Thank you very
again.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you.